For black Christians in Britain, the COVID-19 pandemic is apocalyptic. It's an unveiling of how the world really works. And it's revealed the tattered veneer of national unity, an array of social inequalities, and the political failings that stalk black life. Riding on the coattails of 10 years of government austerity, and observed through the distorted lens of mainstream media, the arrival of the pandemic has foregrounded a black fragility, what Gilmore calls our vulnerability to premature death. In the midst of this crisis, black communities are looking to the church for guidance. What I want to know is, who is speaking truth to power?
We ourselves need to take our own lives into our own hands and move that socio-economic and political dial.
Is the contribution of gospel artists helpful?
We don't have a catalogue of sorrow. We don't have a catalogue of songs that may reflect the day-to-day reality of some people's lives.
And when the pandemic is over, are black churches equipped to advocate for black communities?
Stress ruins so much of our body, messes up the immune system, messes up our physiology, it messes up with the endocrine system, and we dismiss it as if we're Christians, therefore we should be victorious. But no, we're human beings.
My name is Robert Beckford. I'm an academic and broadcaster based in the Midlands. Black Pentecostal churches and black Christians are an integral part of British Christian life. Most of the church growth in recent years can be attributed to the emergence and development of African and African Caribbean congregations. And even when black faces are not present in British pews, their influence is still felt in church music. Less visible are commentators from black churches on social issues, and that includes the current COVID-19 pandemic. We plan to counter the absence of our voices with some black church noise, that is black Pentecostal perspectives on the pandemic. We'll hear from church leaders, pastors, academics, counsellors and musicians, all of whom offer unique insights into the present crisis. Let's begin with a quick review of what the disease actually is. I asked Elizabeth Emmanuel, public health practitioner and currently the Quality Improvement Manager for the NHS North West London collaboration of clinical commissioning groups. She explained what COVID-19 is and why it spread so quickly.
In simple terms, it's an infectious disease caused by the newly diagnosed coronavirus. The 19 is relating to the year that the virus was discovered, which is 2019. It is an infectious disease, which means it can be transferred from person to person. So a pandemic really, in simple words, is a global outbreak of a disease, such as COVID-19 that we're seeing at the moment.
To discover how the black churches have responded, I began by approaching the national ecumenical body, the Churches Together in England. Bishop Dr. Joe Aldred is responsible for Pentecostal and multicultural relations in the organisation. He suggested that the Pentecostal response has been guided by its distinctive theology of the Spirit.
We always start with an idea of the presence of the Spirit. And so one is asking, Lord, what's going on here? Now, because you look at things through the lens of the spiritual and the dynamic presence of God in the world, in our lives, shouldn't mean that we say that this kind of event is somehow from the devil. Okay, it is quite possible to recognize that in the world that God has created, there are various facets to it. Some things are just natural phenomena. They happen. We know that there have been many pandemics and epidemics that have happened in the world in the past. So what we should be doing is saying, Lord, here is something that has happened to us. Enable us, empower us to deal with this. And so we're dealing with it on a human level. Those who have become victims and those who die and those who mourn them, what we should be looking to the Spirit for is power to be the people that can provide comfort, people who can help people, walk with people through the valley of the shadow of death.
But have all black churches been so level-headed? Bishop Aldred again.
I think it's fair to say from my role relating to the wider Pentecostal and charismatic movement in the country that the overwhelming majority of Pentecostals and charismatics have faced this issue with a pretty level head, understanding it as a phenomena. It's something which has hit us all, whoever you are, wherever you are, and you have to face it, not just looking through eyes of skepticism or whatever. But there have been a vocal minority which have played this thing into all kinds of scary eschatological ideas about end times, about 666, 5G, about whether or not there are people from the deep state trying to inject us with stuff so they can control us. What it has said to me is that we have a lot more work to do, particularly on our fringes, but sometimes at the center, to theologically make people more robust so that we're not so susceptible to cranky ideas.
So where does Bishop Aldred see God within the crisis?
We know that 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade didn't cause God to jump out of heaven and jump on one of them ships and stop people throwing us overboard. So that should tell us the nature of the God that we're dealing with, a God who is with you in the pain, and God usually is saying, well, I'm still a God of justice, I'm still a God of righteousness, and God of love and peace. However, there is a time and season. So I think there's some of us in Pentecostalism who understand that pain is part of the human experience, and God is with you in that pain. There's another less helpful response to pain, which is always to see it as an unwelcomed presence, something that the devil has thrown in you. And the response to that is to somehow cast it out. There's a place, of course, for driving things out, but there is also the issue of God's timing and where are you on the journey. There's winter, spring, summer, fall. It isn't always only summer.
What does a spirit-inspired response look like on the ground, where pastors are caring for their communities? Dr. Carol Tomlin is an academic and apostolic leader for the Restoration Fellowship Ministries in Leeds. I asked her what she was doing to help her congregation cope with the crisis.
It literally has taken us by storm. This whole pandemic has affected everybody on a number of domains, emotionally and psychologically. And I had an opportunity of doing a Facebook Live with a counselor who's also a minister from America. And so there are a number of, if you like, initiatives that I and my co-ministers have implemented to respond to COVID. So we've been proactive rather than reactive. The reasons we were prepared for this is because prior to COVID, we already had our Bible study online. We already had live streaming, but critically, we already had a pastoral system responding to the individual needs of congregants, primarily because of the locality. We have individuals with a number of complex needs. Even myself, as a minister, I am a co-carer for 2 members of my family who have dementia. The emotional and the psychological and even the finances all impact and affect and influence and converge on the spiritual.
Joe and Carol are from African Caribbean church contexts. What about the West African churches? Marcus Chilaka is a senior lecturer in health and social care. He's also a pastor in the Redeemed Church of God. He identifies a distinctive historical social context for African Pentecostals, which he suggests equips them to respond effectively.
Pentecostals, we take seriously the matter of life for us being sojourners on earth. We're just sojourners. So the average Pentecostal is mindful of references to the scriptures. For instance, in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, it says, "It's appointed unto man once to die, and after death comes judgment." Nobody is trying to stop death. Even medical practice seeks to prolong life, but never stops death. On the whole, whether people died by pandemic or they died by accident or something else, it's just part of living. So I think this then brings that reality again very closely to many Pentecostals about the reality of life. You find there's a link between people's culture and socioeconomic standing vis-a-vis the way they respond to tragedy. For many within the developed world where Africa and Black Christians predominate, life has not always been luxurious. They've been used to persecutions. They've been used to, poverty. They've been used to bad governance. Not many of them live in luxury. So I would say in the more remote parts of Africa, some are not even sensing that anything very serious is happening. Every day people die out of sickness and disease and preventable causes. So I think some will also submit that more tragic things in quote have happened in some parts of the world. It's not really attracted so much attention. But this time around, it seems to be that the West is more affected. And so we can then understand that people in the West are not too used to, very sudden disruption to their lives.
Seems to me that Black churches have a strong pastoral theology, which orients them towards action. But do they also have the capacity to deal with the political issues emerging from the pandemic? A major issue that has emerged as a result of the pandemic is the pre-existing social inequalities which have exacerbated the spread of the disease in Black and minority ethnic communities. So far, a disproportionately high number of BME communities are represented in the COVID-19 related deaths compared to their percentage in the UK population as a whole. Kehinde Andrews is Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. He thinks that we shouldn't be surprised by these statistics.
We shouldn't be surprised given that Europe and America are the two places which are mostly impacted. And if you look at where Black people are in those societies, it's basically at the bottom. And all of the things that would spread the disease are far more likely to live in cities, far more likely to live in crowded parts of the city, far more likely to be in employment. The areas, if you look at areas of employment with public facing, so transport workers have been dying, NHS in particular in the UK, where we're far more likely to work in the NHS. Also, then you look at issues of poverty, which always has a negative effect on health outcomes. Plus, even take out COVID-19, Black people are far more likely to have underlying health conditions, and so therefore far more if we get it, it's far more likely to be dangerous for us. So all of these factors are coming together to make the position we're in now, where Black communities are just disproportionately being affected and dying of this disease.
Black communities were already disadvantaged before the arrival of the pandemic. 10 years of government austerity has eviscerated, gutted and yammed out the buffers against child poverty, unemployment and healthcare provision in deprived communities. Before COVID-19, Black families were more likely to be living in poverty compared with their white counterparts. Womanist ethicist critic Dr. Gabriella Beckles-Raymond suggests that poor working class Black women will face even more hardship as a result of the pandemic.
I think there are three kind of ways we can look at the impact that COVID will have. So firstly, we know that Black women are already structurally disadvantaged in multiple ways across society, and that the first instance, those existing inequalities will be exacerbated. So in the obvious sense, we know that the economic impact of those poor working conditions, temporary contracts, short-term contracts, Black women are those who will bear the brunt of that. Secondly, I think in addition to exacerbating existing inequalities, there will be new inequalities that arise because of the impact of the virus itself, that will kind of coalesce with those existing inequalities. So, for example, we also know that Black women and Black households are more likely to be overcrowded. We know that Black women are those who are on the forefront of the kind of health and care services, which expose them at greater risk to the virus itself. And so there'll be the compounding of those existing inequalities that impact Black women. I think thirdly, also, we have to be mindful of the fact that the actual response to COVID, like other responses in times of crises across this country, will typically impact the most disadvantaged already. So we can think here of, once you get conversations about scarce resources and decisions being made about whose lives are going to matter, in our response to COVID-19, we know for sure that it is not us who are going to be at the top of the priority list in terms of how we seek to address COVID-19. So I think there are multiple ways in which we have to be mindful and concerned about the position and really plight of Black women during these really frightening times. I'm a basketball player, and we have a phrase in basketball in defense where you got to help the helper. And that means if one person steps up, the defender behind them has to step up and help that person who's helping someone else. And I think there are real questions about, are we really helping the helper in this situation? I mean, Black feminist scholars have spoken about this, from Audre Lorde to Claudia Jones, that if you prioritize the concerns of Black women, you actually attend to the needs of everybody else. And so I think it's incumbent on the church and everyone in all sectors and structures of society to really concern ourselves with Black women.
But the politics of health outcomes is not the only issue for Black Pentecostals to contend with. The representation of Black people in the media is another concern.
I was looking through the British newspapers today following the hashtag Clap for Our Carers, which is a wonderful hashtag originated to appreciate all the doctors and nurses and helpers and carers within the NHS who are putting their lives on the line every day, and even more so now since this pandemic started. Did you notice what was missing? Not a single Black face. Not one. But we all know that that's not what the NHS looks like. Where are the African doctors? Where are the Chinese and Caribbean doctors? Where are all the Asian doctors? Where are the Caribbean nurses? If you've been to a hospital in the UK anywhere in the last, 50 years, you know that that's not what the NHS looks like.
That was an excerpt from comedian Gina Yassere on a Facebook Live post in April. Why did the media whitewash the representation of NHS workers? Kahindi Andrews again.
Part of the problem is just the media in general. If the media is really white in terms of who makes the media, who decides the media, who's presenting the media, people they call on. The other issue is, if you think about when Black people get wheeled out, it's for issues which are seen to be race issues. And this is not seen as a race issue. This is seen as a health issue that's affecting everybody. So yeah, you're not getting the phone calls you get if it was someone called somebody a monkey on TV. But for these bigger things, which is national things, it's not seen as being a race issue, so they don't ask Black people, even though it clearly is massively supporting the Black and Asian communities.
Whitewashing the representation of the NHS is really a struggle over who can and cannot be valorised in the media. And according to Gabriella Beckles-Raymond, Black women are at the centre of this struggle.
There's an image that came to my mind when Boris Johnson was taken into hospital. There was a long-serving nurse, a white woman actually, who was pictured beside him, who had just lost her life to COVID, fighting on the front line. And it just made me think of the ways in which women are valorized by their sacrifice. And in the case of this nurse, she made the ultimate sacrifice of, losing her life, juxtaposed to the way men are valorized for being the ones who have power and stand up on high and kind of give out the directives that impact other people's lives. But it then made me think, gosh, in our communities, we often valorize Black women as the self-sacrificial, selfless person who cares for everybody else. And in this white mainstream context, that's not even getting recognized. For me, there's both the question of this very obvious erasure, but there's also a question about, well, what do we want power to look like? What do we want the celebration of Black life and Black women's lives in particular to look like? Because if I'm only recognized insofar as I sacrifice myself, then that perpetuates my own demise. And so we have to find a way to work together so that the burden of supporting each other as people is shared across genders and, everyone who's able. But more importantly, that we also represent and generate images of Black women who are thriving, who are powerful in their responses, who are giving, but giving in a way that is also edifying to them.
Media racial politics are also played out in the explanations offered for the high rates of infection in black communities. Dr. Alana Lentin is the author of Why Race Still Matters. She suggests a biologically racist argument has influenced the way we are talking about black people and the pandemic.
Saying that black people in the US or the UK or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia are more prone to diabetes, for example, a potential contributory factor aggravating the symptoms of COVID-19, without explaining why this disease and others, such as heart disease, are more prevalent among these communities, ignores the role of racism. As Omar Khan puts it, we end up with a biologically racist argument that naturalizes these illnesses in black and indigenous people. This not only fails to explain where this higher prevalence comes from, but also creates a mindset in which their deaths become inevitable.
That was Dr. Alana Lentin reading an excerpt from her book, Why Race Still Matters. To combat these complex political issues, the black church has to move beyond its comfort zone and become an agent of social change. Joe Aldred again.
Pentecostals who believe in the power of God, one of the things I would certainly like to encourage us to do is to utilize that power from God to help our people, and I mean particularly African Caribbean people, to see that we ourselves need to take our own lives into our own hands and move that dial, move that socio-economic and political dial. I would love to see us teach again this sense of how a people moved by the Spirit can drive an agenda forward that benefits them and benefits community in the wider world. If you stay in the same place, the same thing will happen to you again. You have to find a way of moving, making sure that we are in a place to deal well with life's emergencies means that we have to help ourselves to shift from that place of vulnerability to a place that is more secure. But we are going to have to do it. And I think Pentecostals should take the lead in that.
Well, one place where black Pentecostals regularly express their concerns about life is sacred music. And black gospel artists were one of the first group of musicians to respond to the crisis. A collection of artists produced an a cappella version of the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. The recording was made to inspire NHS workers. This is a wonderful tribute and underlines a creative genius and Christian agency in gospel music. But while the sentiment was wonderful, was the subject appropriate? Great is Thy Faithfulness is a song of praise for God's provision. Does this choice suggest a theological deficiency in the black church music canon? Dr. Pauline Muir is a lecturer at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and author of Sounds Mega, a study of black congregational worship.
I did my PhD looking at congregational singing in black majority churches, that it is African mega churches and also the historic Caribbean churches since the Windrush. Very simply, what I did was to sit in a number of different churches over a long period of time and just documented what they sang. Black churches are often characterized by their music, so high energetic, static, soaring vocals, wonderful, wonderful music. That's often how Black Pentecostalism is characterized in the media, and also it's a means of self-identification as well. What I found in many of the churches that I looked at was that they were songs of victory and overcoming and conquering and songs of hope, which is, of course, is very, very, very important. That is part of the Christian message. But what seemed to be missing were any songs that dealt with lament, fear, disappointment, sorrow, sadness, and also a socio and a political context as well. So the songs are very upbeat, they're often quite fast, often focusing on the major key, which references happiness, brightness, joy, but little space for more negative emotions. But there's another issue as well, and when we look at repertoires, when you look at the kind of the global repertoire, and in my work this was characterized by Christian Copyright Licensing International, which is the license that churches need to reproduce lyrics and so forth. When you look at the top 10, the top 100, you see similar types of repertoires represented. So there are these songs of joy, songs of hope, overcoming. When churches look to the mainstream Christian media to draw their repertoires from, we don't have a catalogue of songs that may reflect the day-to-day reality of some people's lives.
Dr. Dulcie Dixon Mackenzie is a tutor and director at the Centre for Black Theology at the Queen's Ecumenical Foundation in Birmingham. She suggests that the traditions of lament are found in the old songs rather than the new ones.
I would say that we have a collection of songs that our parents were singing, and then we as the second generation, we changed that. And I suppose that's nothing new in history because, first of all we had psalms, and then hymns came along, and then we have gospel songs, and then thinking back to the 70s and 80s when the second generation of Caribbean or Black Christians, we were singing a lot of the American songs, but closer to home we were singing songs from white artists like Keith Green and Graham Kendrick. One of the things that we have now is praise and worship. And so when we go to church now, a lot of the singing is about praising God, doing the praise, as in giving God thanks for something that we've received. Whereas probably before we were singing songs that were a bit more focusing on God and giving God the attention, adoring God, our state of searching for God within ourselves and that honouring God for who God is.
For Dr. Pauline Muir, this departure from lament is a problem.
So for me, this poses a bit of a challenge because it seems to me that there's a cognitive dissonance in terms of when you come into church and your reality may be that, you've lost your job. As we're seeing now with this COVID-19 devastation, is that many people, and many Black people, disproportionately affected by this as well. People are losing their jobs, they're dying, they're working in the healthcare system that's not protecting them. And you go along to a service, albeit online, and the focus is very much upbeat, you're an overcomer, you're going to win. And actually, in this particular moment, you're not winning. So I wonder what that does in terms of A, our faith, but also B, our mental health as well.
Bishop Dr. Delroy Hall is a minister in the Church of God of Prophecy and a university counsellor. He agrees with Dr. Muir and is worried not only about the music, but the consequences of the lockdown on Black communities.
It's nice having the kind of worship songs and the victorious songs, but actually you can't deny or dismiss what's taken place. So my work as a counsellor is that you have to look at what's taken place. So it's dealing with the pain, the grief, the uncertainty, the fear, the doubt, which is all a part of our experience in terms of walking with faith. One of the things about suppressing powerful emotions, if you don't deal with them, they get stronger and they become worse. I know as a pastor for 30 years, people come to church, raise their hands, sing the choruses, but when I go home, and when I visit them in their homes, there's a different story. They're grieving, they're struggling. So I think you can have a lot of people who have all these emotions stored up. It affects our faith, affects our relationship, but also what happens, what we really underestimate, that stress ruins so much of our body, messes up the immune system, messes up our physiology, it messes up with the endocrine system. So it's more than just, just not grieving, it's the complications or the implications are really, really wide. And we dismiss it as if we're Christians, therefore we should be victorious, but no, we're human beings.
Black communities will be set back by COVID. To meet the challenges, should the Black Church also do mission in the line of social justice? Dr. David Muir is a lecturer at the University of Roehampton and has been at the forefront of Black Christian civic action for over 3 decades. He offers a 3-point action plan for Black Pentecostal churches.
Maybe the first thing we may have to do is to repent. Repent is not saying, oh, how sorry you are. Repent is actually doing an about turn. How do we repent and take responsibility for our lack of engagement and our lack of involvement? Racism, discrimination, disproportionality, it's nothing that we don't actually know about. I just feel that we need to find ways to own the problem and to do something about it. Now, of course, not all of our churches are healthy or wealthy. We know that. But those that have got the resources and the wherewithal to make a difference, they've got to find ways to engage with disenfranchised and marginalized Black people, because when a crisis emerges, it's always our folks that take the biggest hit. And I'm not saying that the churches aren't doing anything. We need to find much better and effective ways to make our people a bit more resilient. People need to start to weep before they speak and understand the plight of many of our folks and to do something about it. Let's try to be semi-radical. I think first and foremost, maybe we've got to recalibrate how we think about doing church. Do we need so many churches, and can we combine our forces so we can have 2 or 3 churches in a 1 square mile as opposed to having 5, 6 or even 10? That's the first thing. At least one Sunday in 6, you must need to have a community open day where people are coming in from all over the place. Yes, you feed them and everything else, but people have an opportunity to talk, to actually let off steam and to engage, because that way you get to hear firsthand what are the existential angst and crises that people are facing. And the third thing, I think churches need to be much more politically intentional. And by that I mean, we've got to make sure that we've got both young and old people who are interested in the political configuration of local power brokers. In other words, who are the councillors? Who are the local authority leaders? Who are the local politicians? Who is sitting on the local school boards and so on? In other words, we're going to have to get folks in our church and train them and pray for them and resource them to become activists.
But social engagement is not separate from the life and work of the Holy Spirit. Speaking truth to power is what Christian hope looks like in public. Carol Tomlin again.
We have to give people a message of hope, because one of the things I think that is sorely lacking too often is many people feel hopeless. And I think we have to present a message of hope, because after all, that is what the gospel is about. That message, I feel, has to be strongly communicated.
Within this new framework of action, pastors are not exempt from criticism. David Muir again.
Everyone's talking about speaking truth to power. We know that. We need to speak truth to pastors. And that may mean giving them, a much sharper biblical critique of the things that really matter, and also challenging some of their practices. We don't accomplish kingdom business through anger, but we do accomplish it by being prophetic and by being courageous.
For Kehinde Andrews, a political path cannot rely on state support. It must be independent.
This should make us realise the stakes and realise that we cannot rely on the state. We have to rely on each other, and we have to start to build things for each other. That includes not just community networks, but also businesses and ways that we can really be more resilient economically. Because we're going to have to do something, because it's going to be far worse for us when we come out of this. The most successful Black organisation in the UK and in America certainly is the Black Church. It's independent, gets lots of money, lots of people go. And I think one of the things the church has not been as good at is looking after the body. The spirit is well taken care of in the church, but maybe the body has been a little bit neglected. But the church does have lots of money, lots of resources, big congregations, and maybe this is the time the church can step into the role it needs to use that. Also to think about the health of us here now, where we are now, because that's going to become more important as we go forward.
Building on the global networks within the church, social justice must be transnational. Gabriella Beckles-Raymond.
I think absolutely it's very obvious in this country we need a much stronger socially conscious Black political presence in mainstream politics. The nation state is just a paradigm that is crippling to us. I think we can think about diasporic ways that we can connect and learn from each other. I think that we can think about different organizational structures where power is understood as for the mutual benefit, not for the domination of other people. So if getting someone in mainstream politics allows us to advance that kind of agenda, absolutely.
This is arguably the most critical moment in Black post-war church life. While the Black church has been a powerhouse of the spirit and a reservoir of hope, it has not yet cut its political teeth and taken on the mantle of social justice. After the pandemic is over and we begin to deal with the social and economic devastation in its wake, can the Black church rise to the challenge? Can it move beyond sentiment and provide the spiritual energy for social justice in Black communities? Better Must Come, Black Pentecostals, the Pandemic and the Future of Christianity was written and presented by Robert Beckford and produced by Sheila Marshall for Anaku. We don't have a faith if we don't have social justice. We've got to know if we never touch this. We don't have a faith if we don't have social justice.